7. A face in a dream. They had brought a steel spike and a hammer from the crawler, and Marty hammered the spike into the ledge to provide a holding point for the rope. When that was done and checked and the rope firmly secured, he watched Steve edge his way down the slope into the second cave. The trees swayed and waved as before, and he had a feeling that their branches were clutching upwards towards the descending figure. He remembered the leaf that had brushed his cheek and was afraid. Being plants, they were mindless, of course, but that did not mean they could not be a menace. There were plants on Earth that could trap and eat insects, and Earth plants did not have this fantastic ability to move. But he had not opposed Steve's suggestion that they should explore the rest of the cave system. It was plainly something that had to be done. There was no hope of finding a way out from the top cave. Even if it were possible to locate the spot through which the crawler had crashed, they could not get at it. It was up in the roof of the cave, completely out of reach. They had to explore. The alternative was to sit and wait until their food supplies ran out, until they starved to death. Steve was below treetop level. Marty watched as a nearby branch curled toward him, seemed to touch and stroke him, then drew back. Steve scrambled down the last few yards and cast the rope free. He called up, "Everything okay? Come on down." Marty went down backwards, bracing himself at each step, hanging on to the rope. He did not look round at the trees, but soon could hear the swishing of their branches through the heavy air. He told himself that since Steve had got down safely, there was nothing to worry about, except the trees might be waiting to get both of them within reach before attacking them. That was silly, of course, because it implied thinking, and trees could not think. All the same, his hair bristled. He dropped the last few feet and stood beside Steve. The branches tossed and twisted above their heads but did not come near them. The leaf touching him, the branch that had stroked against Steve, they had probably been accidents. They must have been, since plants could not see either, but he still felt uneasy. Steve was examining the trunk of one of the trees. He said, "It's very smooth. Not bark, I think." He moved to unclip his belt knife. "I wonder if it will cut easily." Marty said, "No." Steve looked at him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Steve looked up thoughtfully at the moving branches. "No, perhaps not. Let's head for that arch which seems to open into the next cave." It was an eerie sensation walking under the threshing branches of the trees, and Marty was anxious to get to more open ground. When they reached it, though, he paused. This was the expanse of greenish-purple fuzz from which the flying balls and the flapping wings had emerged. He put out a tentative foot and found it different from the moss, softer, more deeply resilient. It even seemed to pulsate slightly. But that could have been an illusion. There was no sign of the surface swelling up, but he had the feeling it might happen at any moment. Steve led the way across, walking towards the arch, and Marty followed him. They heard it first when they were almost across the fuzz, but so faint and distant that this, too, could have been something in the mind. He stopped. Steve said, "You hear that? It can't be." They listened, straining their ears. More like the ghost of music than music itself, thin and far away. Marty said, "It's coming from somewhere ahead." "I know. It was more clearly audible as they went under the arch into the next cave. Something like an organ, Marty thought, and strangely familiar. Steve halted again. He said, in shocked disbelief, "I know that tune." Marty said, "I think I do, but I can't place it. It's one of those late 20th century things. A comic opera." He whistled a few bars in accompaniment. "But that's crazy, isn't it? It can't be real." There had been a downward slope in both of the first two caves, which was accentuated in this one. Most of the floor was covered with fuzz, but strange-looking plants grew in places. There was a thicket of cactus-like things, spiked and eccentrically branched, in different shades of blue, and in another place a cluster of small bushes, almost perfectly spherical, grey-streaked with splashes of bright colours. The rock wall on the right showed an uninterrupted glow of moss. On the left, though, and at the bottom, there were openings. It was from one of these that the music must be coming. Several of the openings were above floor level, one of them halfway up to the roof, but they were not inaccessible. Looking closely, Marty saw that there were plants there as well. It was difficult to decide whether they were bushes or trees. What was important about them was that their branches, gnarled and twisted, rose up against the rock face, forming a natural ladder by which one could climb to the galleries. Steve said, "I think the music is coming from the second one along." He moved in that direction. Marty said, "Wait a minute. What for?" "Those trees growing up the side of the cave towards the holes, they're almost like ladders." "Well, yes. We can climb up quite easily. But they only grow under the holes, as though they're just to act as stairways." "True," Steve said. "I hadn't realised that." "For us to climb up?" "I see what you mean. There may be other things here as well as plants. Selenites, giant spiders, more likely to be humanoid if they climb ladders." "That doesn't explain why the ladder trees should be there, and only there." "The Selenites could have planted them and trained them. Maybe they're great gardeners." "And the music? Earth music?" "They probably listen in on our radio." Steve put one foot on the lowest crook of the tree. Marty said, "If there are Selenites up there, they may not be friendly." "That's also true," Steve said. "In which case, we're unlucky. But I don't suppose we can go on dodging them indefinitely. We might as well find out the worst." He climbed the tree and Marty followed him. The surface was rougher than that of the trees in the other cave, but seemed to be worn smooth in places he realized which were as roughly the right intervals to have been made by climbing feet. The music was louder. It changed, in mid-bar almost, to another tune which was vaguely familiar. He came up to the tunnel mouth and could hear it very plainly. Some kind of march. This tunnel was much smaller. It was possible to walk in it, but there was not a lot of room on either side, and at times it was necessary to stoop. The rock surface, as everywhere, was covered with luminous moss. They walked through a tunnel of flickering light towards the sound of music. Then they were round a corner, and the new cave lay ahead. It took Marty a moment or two to realize what was wrong. He had been expecting to see plants and trees similar to the ones they had already encountered, or perhaps even more exotic. There were trees and plants here, but they were wildly out of keeping with the others, or with anything he could have imagined. To start with, there was grass, lush green, calf-high, extending almost to the tunnel mouth. He walked into it, bent down, and held it in his hands. The only green grass he had ever touched had been that in the park back in the bubble, close mown to a length of a centimetre. This was wild, riotous, luxuriant. He picked up a blade and smelt a different scent, the smell of grass itself. Steve had gone past him in the direction of the trees. He stood under one of them and called, "Marty!" The leaves were a darker green than the grass. The trunk grey-brown, rugose branches twisted as though by the slow stresses of long years of growth and weather. Among the leaves there were pink and white blossoms and round green fruit flushed with red. Steve said in a dazed voice, "It's an apple tree." Marty joined him. He said, "I know. One of the first things I remember in kindergarten was that apple in the picture book. But apple trees don't have flower and fruit at the same time. Not on Earth. These are moon apples." "It's an illusion," Steve said. "It has to be." One of the branches hung down, with half a dozen fruits seeming to bow it low. Steve lifted one, weighing it in his open palm. "It seems real enough." He plucked it off. "And smells good." He lifted it to his mouth. Marty said, "Do you think you should?" "Why not?" "I was thinking of what you said about the moss, that even if one could eat it, it would probably be poisonous. Isn't that true of these? We don't know anything about their chemical structure." Steve turned the apple over in his hand. It was not quite round, flattened at the stem end, slightly pointed at the other. Apple-shaped, in fact. Marty could smell it, distinct and individual like the grass. "It looks all right," he said. Marty could feel his own half-abated hunger pangs stirring. He said, trying to convince himself as much as Steve, "It's taking a big chance." Steve said, "What difference does it make? We've got provisions in the crawler for 6 weeks maybe, if we ration ourselves tightly. After that, we starve. We have to take a chance on it sometime." "We might learn more during the month," Marty said. "Maybe..." His words trailed off. He had been intending to say that they could use the time in trying to escape, but even as he framed the proposition, he saw how futile it was. They were trapped inside a mountain, which in turn was surrounded by the lifeless vacuum of the moon. There was no hope at all of getting the crawler out. There was almost as little prospect of finding a way out on foot, which in any case would mean using spacesuits. They could carry a couple of cylinders of air at a pinch and a little food concentrate. Somebody had once spent 8 hours in a spacesuit and survived, but he had been in hospital for weeks afterwards. And in 8 hours on foot, you could be doing well to cover 25 miles. The range of the suit radios was well under a mile. Steve said, "Well, here goes," and bit into the fruit. "What's it like?" Marty asked. "Sensational." He went on eating. Marty picked one himself and bit into it. Juice spurted against his chin. At home he had eaten apple-flavouring puddings of the same mushy consistency as most food in the bubble. That taste had done nothing to prepare him for this. The sweetness, tartness, indefinable something, and the texture of juiciness combined with firmness. He finished it and, after hesitating, dropped the core in the grass. From earliest childhood, he had been trained in the lunar discipline of no waste, no mess. But here there was neither a recovery nor a garbage receptacle. He wondered what the organic cycle was in the caves. Was there bacteria to break things down so that they could be reabsorbed? He shook his head. It was like worrying about a footnote in a book written entirely in gibberish. Steve was eating his second apple. Marty was about to do the same when he saw something else. It was a little way down from the apple tree, and not a tree as much as a large plant. The overlapping bases of big glossy leaves formed a false trunk from which a head emerged, and the head in turn carried perhaps a dozen clusters of long, slightly curving, yellow fruits. He went to look, and Steve came after him. "Apples," Steve said. "And now bananas. Gets crazier and crazier, doesn't it? As though things have been laid on for us, prepared in advance." Marty stretched up and took 2 bananas off one of the clusters. He threw one to Steve. "Catch? Or do you want to wait and see how the apples go down?" He broke the skin and peeled it and bit off an end. Here again, the real thing was vastly different from the artificial flavourings he was used to. Steve, eating the other one, said, "You can almost live off bananas, can't you? They have protein, don't they? In that book I was trying to write, I had one of my pirates marooned on a Pacific island and living on bananas and coconuts, and what fish he could get out of the lagoon. Do you think we could be living inside someone's book?" He looked around. If so, it fills in a pretty solid background. They moved on. They were in an orchard, but one made up of many and diverse trees. There were pears, the fruit a deep golden colour, the skin seeming on the point of bursting with juice. They saw peaches, pomegranates, and scenting the air for a great distance, 6 trees with oranges nestling among the dark leaves. In an open patch, pineapples grew side by side with strawberries, and further on they found a thicket of raspberry canes. There were yet other trees with fruits they did not recognize at all. They ate as they went until they were full. Marty said, "I don't think I can manage anymore." "There's always tomorrow." "Unless the Selenites run us in for trespass and theft. I've been thinking, have you seen any insects?" "No." "Ought there not to be some?" "Why?" "Well, these are plants and they have flowers and fruit. I was thinking of pollination." "Plants on Earth have to have insects because they're all fixed in the ground. This organism has moving parts, remember the leaves and the fuzzballs?" "Not in this cave." "Well, I suppose they could come in here when they were wanted. The leaves moved from one cave to another." "Do you think it's all part of one organism, using the flower for energy?" "I don't know. It could be." "And the Selenites?" "Well, we still haven't found them." "I've been thinking," Marty said, "if we could get news of this place back to our folks, we could all abandon the bubble. People could live here." "Yes," Steve said. "Bring everyone in. blast a hole in the side of the mountain and put in an airlock, so crawlers can go in and out. Smash another gap in the roof of the top cave for an observation ceiling. Build houses and laboratories and a school, not forgetting a recreation centre, and string wires all over the place, so no one has to walk more than 5 yards. I should think the plants and trees are going to look a bit sick by the time you've done a tenth of all that.
I suppose so, Marty said. And we can't get news out anyway. That music's a lot nearer. It must be coming from just past the next bunch of trees.
They walked through and stared up at it in silence. This also was a tree, Marty supposed. At least it grew out of the ground and had what could be possibly described as branches. But the branches were in the shape of long straight pipes in one place, taut, wire-like tendrils in another. Still other branches plucked at the tendrils or soared across them. The music changed into a syrupy waltz, which involved quite a lot of activity in that direction.
An orchestra tree, Steve said, and one that plays itself.
I wouldn't say I admire its taste all that much, but it's quite an achievement for a tree.
We are dreaming, Marty said. We must be. But whose dream is it? Yours or mine? Or someone else's?
The one who's writing the book, maybe. Steve felt with thumb and forefinger for a strand of hair at his temples, grimaced, and tugged a hair out. I'm not dreaming. If you look carefully, you could see that there were holes in the pipe-like branches through which air was presumably sucked or blown. What would be the mechanism of that, Marty wondered. It would be interesting to climb the tree and examine it. He looked again and decided he was not sufficiently interested to try. The thought of going up among those blowing pipes and sawing strings was more than a little scarifying. He turned away, and as he did so, had a glimpse of something further on. It was just a blue flatness seen through a gap between fruit trees. He went that way and called to Steve. They stood, looking at it together. The trees ended, giving way to a lawn, the grass short and velvety green, and the lawn ran down to the still, blue, gleaming waters of a lake. Steve said at last, "There had to be a reservoir of some kind. Plants can't grow without water. How did it get here in the first place, though?" How did any of it get here? Marty thought. There were too many questions, all the same question repeated from 100 different angles, and there had to be answers somewhere. He went across the lawn to the water's edge. At that point the grass ended and the familiar moss took over again, running out under the lake and lighting it from below. He looked automatically for fish but could see nothing. The waters were clear and empty. He dipped his fingers in. The temperature was only a degree or two less than that of the air. One could swim in it comfortably. He looked along the lake. It occupied the full width of the cave under the arching moss-covered roof. At the end he could not be sure, but it looked as though the cave and lake twisted away to the right. He said, "I wonder how far these caves go. For miles, maybe." "Yes." Steve's voice was abstracted. Marty turned from the water and saw that he was looking up at the roof of the cave. He said in a slightly puzzled voice, "Marty?"
"Yes?"
"Do you notice anything about the light?"
"From the moss? I don't think... Wait a minute. Is it dimmer than it was?"
It was happening very gradually. At first he could not be sure whether the light really was a shade less bright, or whether he had been influenced by Steve's question. But soon the darkening was unmistakable. The glow was fading from the moss-covered ceiling and walls, and the blue of the lake was deeper as its radiance drained away. The fading became more and more rapid. Shaken, Marty said, What do you think this is?" It was very dark, and even as he spoke, blackness came down on them. Steve said, "I don't know. Could be temporary, I suppose. I hope so." They waited, but there was no change in the darkness. After the first surprise, they had taken for granted the fact of being able to see their way, or being surrounded by light and colour. It was frightening to be forced to realize again where they were, trapped in the bowels of this alien world. If they had stayed in the first cave, they would at least have had the crawler, with lighting as long as the batteries held out. They had not even brought hand torches with them. They had not seemed necessary. But it had been careless not to take the precaution. It would be a difficult and perilous job to find their way back there now. Beside him, Steve said, "I'm gonna lie down. Might as well be comfortable while we wait for the lights to go up again." It was reassuring to hear his voice. 2 together was better than 1. Marty said, "How long do you think?" "There's no knowing, is there? An hour perhaps, or a day, or a century." That last thought was chilling. Marty argued, "It can't be too long a time. The trees must have had regular days." "That would be true on Earth, but we don't know about moon trees. We don't even know if they're still there. The orchestra tree has stopped." The music had faded with the light. There was only silence and blackness and their own small echoing voices. What if the caves had days a century long, and they had chanced on them as evening was merging into night? It did not seem likely, but probability had gone by the board from the moment of finding themselves in the first cave. They talked together in companionship against the darkness, discussing what they had found in the caves and trying yet again to find a meaning in them. They did not progress very far, over and over coming round to the same contradictions and bafflement. Gradually, conversation lapsed, the gaps between talk lengthening. After one such gap, Marty said, "If there are Selenites, how do they manage in the darkness? And there must be some sort of inhabitants. It doesn't make sense otherwise. Anyway, I'm sure those were footmarks on the ladder trees." There was no answer from Steve. After a pause, he said, "Don't you agree? I mean, the orchard has to be 4 people, hasn't it?" Steve still did not reply. His breathing was deep and even. Marty realized he had fallen asleep. He lay back, stretching himself on the grass. It was softer than the lawn back in the bubble. He tried to answer his own question about the Selenites. How did they manage in the dark? But perhaps they were nocturnal and could see, like cats. In which case... He sat bolt upright and then relaxed. That was nonsense. There was no catmen advancing on them through the blackness. One would hear them coming. Except that another thing he knew about cats, even though he had never seen one, was that they trod lightly, noiselessly, stalking their prey. He started to lean over, to shake Steve and wake him, and checked himself. It would be stupid to do that. His imaginings were stupid anyway. All the time his nerve endings quivered, He tried lying down, but could not rest. He found himself cramped whatever position he adopted. It was not the fault of the ground, he knew. Steve was sleeping peacefully, but of his own tension. He checked his finger watch again and again as the slow minutes dragged by. The darkness had lasted nearly 2 hours. It seemed a lot longer. At last he slept and had a nightmarish dream in which the caves and the bubble were all mixed up, and Mr. Sherrin was lecturing him for having sent up a mass of balloons which turned into leaves and suddenly came down, whirling round their ears. He drifted back to consciousness as he was trying to tell Mr. Sherrin that it was all right, they would go away again, and saw that the light had returned. The moss was glowing all round as it had done before. Sleep and the dream still pressed on him and confused him, but he realized that someone was standing near, a face looking down. "Steve," he said, "what do you think?" That was when he came properly awake and sat up in shock and fear, for the face was not Steve's, but that of a bearded stranger.